December 04, 1945, Tokyo, Japan. The gymnasium smelled of damp wood and ash. Outside, snow fell in soft, hesitant flakes over the ruins of what had once been Tokyo's Shibuya district. The war had ended 5 months earlier, but the city still wore its scars openly. Blackened steel beams jutting from rubble, empty window frames staring like hollow eyes, and everywhere, the gray dust of pulverized concrete that settled on skin and clothing and seemed to seep into the soul itself. Inside the makeshift auditorium, 300 Japanese women sat in rigid silence. They perched on salvaged wooden benches, their backs straight, their hands folded in their laps. Most wore the standard momp, the baggy work trousers issued during the war years, now faded and patched. Their faces were carefully neutral, trained by years of propaganda and loss to reveal nothing. Some were widows. Some were mothers who had sent sons to die in distant jungles. All of them had been taught, day after day through loudspeakers and newspapers and schoolroom lessons, that the Americans were demons incarnate, savage, godless creatures who would defile their daughters and burn their homes. Now those same Americans stood before them on a makeshift stage constructed from ammunition crates and salvaged lumber. 25 young men in United States Army uniforms, members of the 8th Army Chorus, arranged themselves in 4 neat rows. The afternoon light filtered through patched windows, casting long shadows across their faces. They were barely older than the sons these women had lost. 20, 22, perhaps 25 years old. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit and college students from California, thrust into uniform and shipped across an ocean to occupy the land they had helped to destroy. The gymnasium fell silent except for the distant sound of hammering. Somewhere in the ruins, Tokyo was beginning the long, impossible task of rebuilding itself. The conductor, a thin sergeant from Pennsylvania with wire-rimmed glasses, raised his baton. To understand what happened in that gymnasium on that January afternoon, one must first understand the machinery of expectation, the vast apparatus of propaganda and ideology that had shaped Japanese consciousness throughout the war years. From 1937 onward, the Japanese military government had constructed an elaborate mythology around the American enemy. Through films, radio broadcasts, textbooks, and public lectures, the Americans were portrayed not merely as adversaries but as a kind of subhuman threat, barbarous, materialistic, spiritually hollow beings whose mongrel democracy bred weakness and whose obsession with comfort had drained them of warrior virtue. Japanese women had been told that American soldiers raped and pillaged without conscience. They had been shown doctored photographs, heard fabricated testimonies, absorbed 8 years of carefully calibrated fear. In the final months of the war, when American victory became inevitable, Japanese authorities distributed pamphlets instructing women to commit suicide rather than face capture. On Saipan and Okinawa, hundreds of civilians had thrown themselves from cliffs, clutching their children, choosing death over the imagined horrors of American occupation. The propaganda had been so thorough, so pervasive, that when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, millions of Japanese civilians genuinely believed they would be exterminated. In the days following the surrender, Tokyo's streets emptied. Families barricaded themselves in their homes. Women hid in basements and storage rooms, waiting for the inevitable atrocities to begin. But the atrocities did not come. Instead, the Americans arrived with chocolate bars and chewing gum. They arrived with medicine and food supplies. They arrived with cameras and easy smiles, and they began the unprecedented work of rebuilding the nation they had just defeated. Under General Douglas MacArthur's administration, the occupation forces initiated sweeping democratic reforms: land redistribution, women's suffrage, labor unions, freedom of press. The contrast between expectation and reality was so stark, so disorienting, that it created a kind of psychological vertigo throughout the occupied territories. Yet even as the Americans demonstrated restraint and generosity, suspicion lingered. The 300 women sitting in that gymnasium in January 1946 had lived through fire and starvation. They had watched their cities burn in great conflagrations that turned night into day. They had eaten grass and bark and sawdust bread. They had lost husbands and brothers and sons to a war their leaders had promised would establish Japan's eternal dominance. Trust did not come easily. The American military government understood this. They understood that occupation could not succeed through force alone, that democracy could not be imposed at gunpoint. They needed something else, something that could speak past the machinery of propaganda, past the language barrier, past the accumulated weight of fear and loss. They needed a different kind of communication. Music, they decided. Music would be their ambassador. The 8th Army Chorus had been formed in the autumn of 1945, just weeks after the surrender. Military officials recognized that morale among occupation forces was fragile. Young men who had fought brutal campaigns across the Pacific now found themselves administrators of a defeated population, tasked with reconstruction rather than combat, paperwork rather than warfare. The chorus gave soldiers something to do, a sense of purpose beyond guard duty and bureaucratic routine. But the chorus served another function as well. As it began performing for Japanese audiences, first in small gatherings, then in larger venues, it became a kind of cultural weapon, wielded not to destroy but to persuade. The very fact of the chorus challenged Japanese assumptions about American barbarism. Savages did not sing four-part harmonies. Demons did not perform Bach and Brahms. The music itself became evidence of a deeper civilization, a complexity that propaganda had systematically erased. The repertoire was carefully chosen. American folk songs like Shenandoah and Home on the Range to demonstrate the nation's frontier spirit. Spirituals like Go Down Moses and Deep River to reveal the soul and suffering embedded in American history. Classical European pieces, Handel's Hallelujah Chorus, Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus, to prove cultural sophistication. And finally, selections from American musical theater, songs from Rodgers and Hammerstein, Jerome Kern, George Gershwin, to showcase the creative abundance of democratic culture. This was strategic artistry, soft power deployed through song. Every performance was a kind of argument, a refutation of wartime propaganda. Look, the music said. Listen. We are not what you were told we were. In the gymnasium that January afternoon, the conductor's baton descended. The chorus began with America the Beautiful. Catherine Lee Bates hymn to spacious skies and amber waves of grain, set to Samuel Ward's soaring melody. The 25 voices rose in perfect unison, filled the makeshift auditorium, echoed off the patched walls. The sound was impossibly rich, impossibly full, bass voices providing foundation, tenors lifting the melody skyward, harmonies weaving through the cold air like golden thread. The Japanese women sat motionless, their faces carefully blank. They had been invited to this performance by occupation authorities, encouraged to attend, but compulsion and invitation were difficult to distinguish in those early months. Many had come because they feared consequences if they refused. Others came out of simple curiosity, a chance to see the occupiers up close, to measure the reality against the mythology they had absorbed for 8 years. But as the first song continued, something began to shift in the gymnasium's atmosphere. The women's posture remained rigid, but eyes that had stared at the floor now lifted to watch the stage. The music itself was unfamiliar. American patriotic songs held no cultural resonance for Japanese ears, but the quality of the voices, the obvious discipline and training, the sheer beauty of the harmonized sound, these things transcended language and ideology. The chorus moved through its repertoire with military precision. Shenandoah, with its haunting melody and lyrics about rivers and distant shores, a song about longing and separation that spoke directly to women who had waved goodbye to sons and husbands who never returned. The battle hymn of the Republic, triumphant and terrible, its imagery of trampling out the vintage where grapes of wrath are stored, a victory song that must have cut deep, reminding every listener of their nation's defeat. Then the tempo shifted. The conductor raised his hand, and the chorus began, "Swing low, sweet chariot," the spiritual born from slavery's crucible, carrying within its simple melody the weight of African-American suffering and hope. The bass voices rumbled like distant thunder. The tenors soared above, pure and clear. The harmonies locked together with a precision that seemed almost impossible, 25 individual voices merging into a single, unified instrument of extraordinary power. And something broke in the gymnasium. Later, witnesses would struggle to describe exactly what happened. There was no single moment of transformation, no dramatic instant when resistance crumbled. Instead, a gradual thawing, the slow melt of ice that has frozen solid through a long winter. One woman in the third row began to weep silently, tears streaming down her face while her expression remained fixed. Another pressed a hand to her mouth. A young widow in the back, whose husband had died at Guadalcanal, closed her eyes as if the music caused physical pain. The Americans continued singing, unaware of the quiet devastation they were causing. They performed "Going Home," the melody extracted from Dvorak's New World Symphony. A song about journey's end, about rest after long labor, about the universal human hunger for return and peace. They sang "Danny Boy," that most melancholy of ballads, about love and loss and seasons passing. They sang "Steal Away," another spiritual, its coded lyrics once guiding enslaved people toward freedom, now simply aching with longing for deliverance from suffering. Every song was a small fracture in the wall of propaganda, every harmony an erosion of the carefully constructed mythology about American savagery. How could these voices belong to demons? How could such beauty emerge from barbarism? The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. Everything these women had been taught, everything they had believed about the enemy, everything they had used to make sense of the war and its horrors, all of it was being quietly, relentlessly challenged by the simple fact of this music. One of the organizers, a Japanese translator named Miyamoto Keiko, who had studied at Columbia University before the war and returned to Tokyo just before Pearl Harbor, watched the audience carefully. She had been skeptical of the performance's potential impact. Music seemed like such a small thing against the magnitude of destruction, such a fragile instrument for bridging the chasm between victor and vanquished. But as she observed the women's faces, the tears, the trembling hands, the expressions of confusion and wonder and grief, she began to understand something profound about the power of aesthetic experience to bypass intellectual defenses, to speak directly to the heart. The concept was not entirely new. Throughout history, conquerors had used culture as a tool of subjugation or persuasion. Rome had exported gladiatorial games and theater throughout its empire. Napoleon had brought French opera to occupied territories. But what the Americans attempted in post-war Japan was different in both scale and intention. They were not seeking merely to impose their culture but to demonstrate, through tangible evidence, the fruits of democratic society. The abundance, the creativity, the diversity of voices and visions that flourished when individual liberty was protected. The chorus itself embodied this democratic ideal. Among its 25 members were Catholics and Protestants and Jews, farm boys and intellectuals, men whose families had emigrated from Ireland and Italy and Poland and Germany. This diversity, which Japanese militarist ideology would have identified as weakness, mongrelization, corruption of pure national character, somehow produced not chaos but harmony. 25 different backgrounds and beliefs, blending their voices into unified beauty. This was the symbolism that MacArthur's cultural strategists hoped to convey. Look, they wanted to say, this is what democracy sounds like. Not uniformity imposed from above, but voluntary cooperation producing something greater than any individual could achieve alone. The women in the gymnasium could not articulate this symbolism, but they felt its force. Many had been raised in the rigid hierarchy of pre-war Japanese society, where every individual's place was fixed by birth and tradition, where deviation from social norms brought shame upon one's family, where the collective always superseded the individual. The war had intensified this regimentation, rations distributed according to strict protocols, work assignments made by bureaucratic decree, private life subordinated entirely to national mobilization. And here, suddenly, was evidence of a different possibility. Men who had volunteered to serve, who sang not because the state commanded it but because they chose to create beauty together. The voluntary nature of their cooperation was itself revolutionary to audiences shaped by authoritarian collectivism. After 40 minutes, the formal program concluded. The conductor lowered his baton, and the gymnasium filled with uncertain silence. In America, audiences would have burst into immediate applause. But Japanese cultural norms were different, more restrained. The women sat quietly, unsure how to respond, whether response was even permitted. Then one of the soldiers, a tenor from Nebraska named Thomas Whitmore, whose brother had died at Iwo Jima, stepped forward. Through the translator, he suggested something unprecedented, an impromptu song circle where the Japanese women might share their own music and the Americans could learn from them. The translator, Miyamoto Keiko, conveyed this suggestion with considerable anxiety. Japanese folk songs carried deep cultural meaning, often religious significance. To share them with occupiers felt almost sacrilegious. She expected the women to decline politely, to retreat into formal politeness. Instead, after a long, trembling silence, an elderly woman in the front row stood. She was perhaps 60 years old, dressed in a worn kimono, her face deeply lined. Through the translator, she explained that her 2 sons had been killed in the war, one in China, one in the Philippines. She said she had come to this performance expecting nothing, perhaps hoping only to glimpse the faces of the men who had destroyed her country and her family. But the music, she said quietly, had reminded her that suffering was not unique to Japan. The spirituals especially, those songs born from slavery's horror, had spoken of a pain as deep as her own. Perhaps, she suggested, all people who had endured war and loss shared something fundamental, something that transcended the boundaries of nation and enemy. She began to sing, her voice thin and wavering but pure. The song was Sakura, the cherry blossom song, ancient and beloved, associated with the fleeting beauty of life, the acceptance of impermanence that lay at the heart of Japanese aesthetic philosophy. Her voice carried through the gymnasium like smoke, delicate and haunting. One by one, other women joined her. A young mother sang Akatanbo, Red Dragonfly, a children's song about childhood memories and lost innocence. A group of factory workers, women who had assembled weapons during the war, sang Furusato, Hometown, about longing for native places and the universal ache of nostalgia. And the American soldiers listened. They could not understand the words, but they recognized the emotions: sorrow, longing, resilience, hope. Some of them had tears in their eyes. These were men who had fought across terrible battlefields, who had witnessed unimaginable carnage at Peleliu and Okinawa and Luzon. They had been trained to see the Japanese as enemies, perhaps as something less than fully human. Propaganda worked on both sides of the Pacific. But here, listening to these songs of heartbreak and home, they could not sustain that dehumanization. Thomas Whitmore, the tenor from Nebraska, found himself weeping openly. His brother had died taking a pillbox on Iwo Jima, shot 3 times in the chest by a Japanese soldier who was probably no older than the boys now singing for him. Whitmore had carried hatred across the Pacific like a stone in his gut. But something in this exchange, these voices reaching across the abyss of war, cracked that stone, let some of the poison drain away. What occurred in that gymnasium was, in miniature, the larger transformation that would reshape Japan in the years following surrender. The occupation brought unprecedented change: a new constitution, women's voting rights, land reform that broke up feudal estates, zaibatsu dissolution, education reform that removed militarist indoctrination from schools. But these structural changes alone could not have succeeded without a corresponding shift in consciousness, a fundamental reimagining of what relationship was possible between victor and vanquished. The women who attended that concert in January 1946 carried their experience outward into devastated Tokyo. They told neighbors and family members about the singing Americans, about the unexpected beauty of enemy voices, about the small miracle of shared music. The story spread through Tokyo's neighborhoods like ripples across water, carried by women who worked in factories and markets and shelters, who stood in ration lines and crowded into relief stations. In the months that followed, the 8th Army Chorus performed dozens more concerts across Japan. They sang in Osaka and Kyoto, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cities where American bombs had incinerated tens of thousands in single blinding moments. They sang in prisoner-of-war camps and hospitals, in orphanages and schools. Everywhere they went, they carried the same implicit message: we are not what you were told. We are capable of beauty. We are capable of restraint. We are capable of rebuilding what war has destroyed. The symbolic power of these concerts extended beyond the immediate audiences. Photographs of American soldiers singing for Japanese civilians appeared in newspapers overseen by occupation authorities. Newsreels showed Japanese children clapping along to American folk songs. The images served as visual arguments, evidence that peaceful coexistence was possible, that the emperor's surrender had not led to the prophesied extinction of the Japanese people. Some historians have argued that this cultural campaign was manipulative, a sophisticated form of psychological warfare designed to pacify a defeated population and ease the imposition of American hegemony. This criticism contains truth. The concerts were not innocent artistic expression. They were strategic instruments of occupation policy, carefully calibrated to achieve specific political objectives. But dismissing them as merely propaganda ignores their genuine emotional impact, the real human connections forged in those makeshift auditoriums. The women who wept at that January concert were not simply victims of manipulation. They were human beings encountering unexpected beauty in the midst of devastation, discovering that the world was more complex than wartime mythology had suggested. Their tears were not manufactured. They were authentic responses to the collision between expectation and reality. In Tokyo during the winter of 1946, food was the dominant obsession. The war had shattered Japan's agricultural infrastructure. The naval blockade had strangled imports. The firebombing campaign had destroyed storage facilities and distribution networks. By January, most Japanese subsisted on roughly 1,000 calories per day, less than half the necessary intake for basic health. Children's growth was stunted. Adults lost weight steadily, their bodies consuming themselves. Black markets flourished in every neighborhood, selling rice at astronomical prices that most families could not afford. American occupation forces had access to abundance unimaginable to starving Japanese civilians. Military mess halls served bacon and eggs, coffee with cream and sugar, fresh bread, canned fruits, chocolate desserts. The contrast was obscene, a daily reminder of the war's outcome, of victor and vanquished, of who controlled resources and who went hungry. But the occupation authorities implemented food distribution programs. American grain ships arrived carrying wheat and rice. Military rations were supplemented to Japanese distribution networks. School lunch programs began feeding children at least one solid meal daily. These programs were motivated partly by genuine humanitarian concern, partly by pragmatic recognition that starving populations bred instability, but their impact was undeniable. For many Japanese civilians, American food became the most tangible symbol of occupation's contradictory nature. The same nation that had incinerated their cities now fed their children. The same military that had killed millions now distributed rice and canned milk. This paradox was almost impossible to reconcile with wartime propaganda about American cruelty. Some of the women at that January concert had received food assistance from occupation authorities. Their children attended schools where American surplus fed them lunches. This material abundance was not accidental. It was part of a deliberate strategy to demonstrate the prosperity that democratic capitalism could generate. Look, the policy suggested. This is what the American system produces. Not military glory or spiritual purity, but food, medicine, material comfort, the practical abundance that totalitarianism had promised but never delivered. The symbolism was powerful precisely because it was edible. You could not argue with a full stomach. You could not dismiss as lies the bread that silenced your child's crying. The food became evidence, tangible proof that undermined years of propaganda more effectively than any speech or pamphlet. Months after that first concert, the 8th Army Chorus planned a special performance, an ambitious program that would bring together Japanese and American musicians in a collaborative concert. The idea was fraught with difficulty. Language barriers complicated rehearsals. Cultural differences in musical theory and performance practice created friction. And beneath all practical concerns lay the deeper awkwardness of collaboration between former enemies, the unspoken weight of all that had happened. But the concert was held in May 1946, in Tokyo's partially restored Hibiya Public Hall. Japanese traditional musicians performed gagaku court music, ancient and stately. Japanese children's choirs sang folk songs. And then the American chorus joined Japanese performers for a combined rendition of Beethoven's Ode to Joy, that most universal of anthems, proclaiming brotherhood across all barriers. The symbolism was perhaps too obvious, too heavy-handed. But the audience of over 1,000 Japanese civilians responded with prolonged applause, many in tears. For people who had lived through years of militaristic isolation, who had been taught that Japan must conquer or be exterminated, who had experienced total war's devastation, this simple act of musical collaboration represented something almost miraculous, the possibility of connection across the deepest wounds imaginable. In the audience that May evening was a young Japanese woman named Nakamura Fumiko. She had lost her husband at Okinawa, her brother in the Philippines. She had survived the Tokyo firebombings by sheer chance, having left the city the day before the March 10, 1945 raid that killed over 100,000 people in a single night. She had come to the concert skeptical, still carrying profound anger at the Americans who had destroyed so much. But watching Japanese and American musicians performing together, hearing their voices blend in Beethoven's proclamation that all men become brothers, she felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness seemed too small a word, inadequate to the scale of what had been lost. But perhaps the beginning of a release, a recognition that continuing to carry hatred would only perpetuate the war's damage in new forms. Years later, she would write in her memoir about that evening, about how the music had created a space where grief and hope could coexist, where the past's horror could be acknowledged without determining the future's shape. "We had believed Americans were devils," she wrote. "But devils do not sing like that. Perhaps they were simply men, as flawed and capable of beauty as ourselves." The transformation of Japanese attitudes toward Americans did not happen uniformly or completely. Many Japanese, particularly those who had lost family members, never fully reconciled themselves to occupation. Resentment simmered beneath surface politeness. Economic deprivation continued for years. The reforms imposed by occupation authorities were sometimes resisted, sometimes misunderstood. But the concerts, along with countless other small interactions between occupiers and occupied, gradually eroded the wall of propaganda that had defined Japanese understanding of America during the war years. By the time the occupation formally ended in 1952, Japan and the United States had established a relationship unprecedented in the history of warfare. Victor and vanquished transformed into allies, partners in rebuilding, eventually friends. This transformation was not inevitable. It required deliberate policy choices: MacArthur's decision to retain the emperor, the American commitment to reconstruction rather than mere punishment, the Japanese people's extraordinary resilience and capacity for adaptation. But it also required smaller, subtler influences, like those concerts where American voices sang for Japanese ears, where music became a language that transcended propaganda and ideology. The Eighth Army Chorus was eventually disbanded as occupation forces scaled down. Its members returned to civilian life in America, carrying memories of singing in devastated cities for audiences who had every reason to hate them but who instead wept at the beauty of harmonized voices. Many of the soldiers maintained correspondence with Japanese friends they had made, relationships that began with suspicion and fear but evolved into genuine connection. On quiet nights in the years following the war, women across Tokyo would sometimes hum the melodies they had learned from those American concerts. Shenandoah, sung while preparing thin soup over charcoal stoves. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, hummed while queuing for rations. These songs became part of the city's soundscape, woven into the fabric of daily survival. The women did not necessarily understand all the English words they sang, but they understood the emotions embedded in the melodies: longing, hope, resilience, the determination to endure. These were universal languages, speaking to experiences that war had made common to both Japanese and Americans. In this way, music accomplished what policy alone could never achieve. It created empathy, built bridges across the chasm of recent violence. It reminded people who had been taught to see each other as subhuman that humanity itself was the deepest truth, transcending nation and ideology. The elderly woman who had stood first to sing Sakura at that January concert lived another 15 years. She witnessed Japan's remarkable recovery, the economic miracle that transformed a devastated nation into a prosperous democracy. Before her death in 1961, she was interviewed by a Japanese historian documenting the occupation period. Asked what she remembered most vividly from those difficult years, she did not speak of hunger or hardship or loss, though she had endured all three. She spoke instead of the American soldiers singing, their young voices rising in that cold gymnasium, carrying harmonies that somehow contained both sorrow and hope, both power and gentleness. "I realized they were just boys," she said quietly, "far from home, trying to make sense of what they had done and seen, just like all of us. The music showed me that. It let me see them as they truly were." This is what remains when the machinery of war finally falls silent. Not victory or defeat, not conquest or surrender, but the slow, difficult work of rebuilding human connection across the ruins. The story of those concerts in occupied Japan is not a tale of American virtue or Japanese victimhood. It is something more complex, a testament to the possibility that even the deepest wounds might eventually heal, that even the most carefully constructed hatreds might dissolve when confronted with unexpected beauty. The women who sat in that gymnasium on that January afternoon in 1946 had lived through catastrophe. They had been shaped by propaganda and ideology, by loss and privation, by the brutal machinery of total war. Everything in their experience had prepared them to hate the Americans standing before them. But the voices they heard that day told a different story, a story about the capacity for creation amid destruction, about the voluntary cooperation that produces harmony, about the abundance that freedom generates. The music became evidence that no propaganda could erase, proof that the world contained possibilities their leaders had denied. In the end, those concerts did not erase the past. They did not undo Hiroshima or Nanking, could not restore the millions of dead to life. But they opened a door to a different future, demonstrated that victor and vanquished need not remain locked in eternal enmity. They showed that even amid occupation's inherent violence and inequality, moments of genuine human connection remained possible. This was democracy's true face, not the imperial arrogance the Japanese had been told to expect, but a strange, imperfect generosity. Men singing for former enemies. Food distributed to the hungry. Reforms that granted women the vote and workers the right to organize. Abundance shared, power restrained, rebuilding undertaken with something approaching partnership. The women who left that gymnasium carried this knowledge outward into devastated Tokyo, into a nation struggling to reimagine itself. They told their families and neighbors what they had witnessed. Not demons, but young men with trained voices, singing songs of home and hope and shared humanity. This small truth, multiplied by thousands of similar encounters across occupied Japan, helped transform an occupied population into citizens of a new democratic nation, wartime enemies into peacetime allies. The hymns of occupation, those American voices rising in makeshift auditoriums throughout Japan, became part of the sound by which a new world was born. Not through conquest alone, but through the patient, difficult work of proving that former enemies might learn, note by note, measure by measure, to harmonize together. And on cold Tokyo nights, if you listen carefully, you might still hear those melodies drifting through the ruins, Shenandoah and Sakura, Swing Low and Furusato, American and Japanese voices blending, teaching what propaganda had denied, that beneath the machinery of nation and ideology, beneath the savage necessities of war, human beings remained capable of recognizing each other's sorrow, celebrating each other's beauty, and singing, finally, impossibly, together.